The Iranian government must understand that the world is watching. We mourn each and every innocent life that is lost. We call on the Iranian government to stop all violent and unjust action against its own people. Here to talk about it this morning, Senator John McCain. Senator, you have been very critical all week of the president and the line he has taken. What exactly do you want him to do?
Well, I appreciate the statement that he made yesterday that was far stronger, and I think we need to continue to send that message. Bob, you and I are both students of history. In fact, we've had a chance to observe some history. But back on July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers declared one universal principle that all of us are endowed with certain inalienable rights. And this is a human rights issue. This is an issue about whether people can freely demonstrate their disagreement with their government without being beaten and killed in the streets. And this is a long, long history of American advocacy and leadership for human rights. Now, I'm not for sending arms. I'm not for fomenting violence, nothing except to say that America's position in the world is one of moral leadership. And that's what America's all about. And frankly, it's not only what's about taking place in the streets of Tehran, but it's also what takes place in America's conscience.
Well, let me just ask you this, Senator. The president is obviously walking a very fine line here. If he takes a tougher line, he could run the risk of letting the Iranian government use that as an excuse to blame it on us, the great Satan, as they call us.
Well, first of all, the fine line is being dictated by the brutality in the streets of Tehran and the other cities in Iran. The United States hasn't done anything except to what we should do, and that is, as we did in the Congress on Friday, and that was a joint resolution, Congressman Berman and Pence in the House and Senator Lieberman and me in the Senate, again, reaffirming our conviction that people have the right to peacefully disagree with their government. And so here we are, again, having to be on the right side of history. We have to be on the right side of history. Well, now, every time that there's been a totalitarian or dictatorial government that has faced protest from their citizenry, they blame the United States. When the Prague Spring took place, there were many on the left in American politics. Don't encourage them. When the workers of Gdansk in Poland were fighting for their freedom, we shouldn't interfere. We did give them moral support. After the Berlin Wall came down, guess what? They said, you were the beacon of hope. One of the great honors of my life, and I'm sure yours, is to meet Nathan Sharansky. After the president's Axis Evil Empire speech, he said it spread like wildfire throughout the Gulag. There were those at that time that said, including the then Soviet Union, don't interfere in our affairs. America has the moral obligation. And again, that does not mean that we are for sending arms or anything else, although we certainly gave assistance to certain elements during the Cold War.
But let me ask you this. What if the president does really ramp up the rhetoric? What if he takes a much harder line, and then the Iranian government simply ignores it, the crackdown is brutal, people are killed? What does the United States do then?
Well, I think we're faced with the same dilemma that we were during the Cold War throughout centuries. If I could give you very briefly, Daniel Webster, one of the great senators in history, spoke about the Greek Revolution in 1823. And he said, when he was responding to people that said that mere rhetorical support would do no good, and I quote him, he said, I hope it may. It may give them courage and spirit. It may assure them of public regard, teach them that they're not wholly forgotten by the civilized world, and inspire them with constancy in the pursuit of their great end. And then he said, whether it helped or not, he said it was due to our character and called for by our own duty. Daniel Webster was right then. Ronald Reagan was right. Harry Truman was right. Scoop Jackson was right. Jack Kennedy was right when he said we'll go anywhere and bear any burden. The fact is that America has been and will be the beacon of hope and freedom. And we are not saying that the people who are now risking their lives, and some giving them in the streets in cities of cities and towns in Iran, but we are saying we're on their side as they seek freedom.
What Senator Richard Lugar, ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, said this morning there could be a very brutal outcome to all of this. He thinks it's very dangerous what's happening. He also suggests, Senator, that President Obama or Secretary of State Clinton should sit down with their counterparts and talk about this in the Iranian government.
Well, first of all, we ought to decide which government to negotiate with. That certainly a lot of the Iranian people aren't exactly expressing confidence, the one that is in power now. But shouldn't we, before we decide when to sit down and what to talk about, see what happens in this train of events, which has surprised literally every expert that's taking place in Iran today? Yes, it is in our national security interest to negotiate Iranian nuclear acquisition or movement toward weapons and missiles to launch them. But is this the time to talk about that? Shouldn't we see how this whole thing plays out and spend our time giving our moral support?
Well, what are our options besides just giving moral support right now?
Actually, we don't have a lot. We didn't have a lot during the Cold War. And we may have made a mistake when we gave too much encouragement to the Hungarian Revolution. But during the Prague Spring and in Poland, still talk to Polish people today. They'll say, you were the beacon, you were the hope. And yet there were many who said, no, no, you will incite violence, there will be further repression. Bob, we've seen this movie before. And again, it's not so much about Iran, although it certainly is at the moment, but it's also about being on the right side of history. And I don't consider it meddling when you stand on the side of the principles that made our nation the greatest nation in history.